Hey everyone, it's OSK, and welcome back to the channel. I'm going to get a little serious on you for a second and start getting into some advanced concepts in Spellbreak. There are a million guides on YouTube about how to play Frost, or how to play this build, or how to move well, or how to do this, how to do that. We're not going to talk about that here. If that's your idea of good content, this video is not going to be for you. Anybody can get good with Frost, anybody can learn to aim, and anybody can learn to move well in the game given enough time and practice. What I'm going to do on this channel is train your brain. You need to learn how to think in order to win consistently in this game, and it's almost never enough just to be good at aiming, even if it does help. No, you need to play smart, and if you're a guy like me who isn't particularly gifted in mechanics, then this video is especially for you. In this new series I'm calling Spellbreak Academy, you will learn how to approach each situation with the right frame of mind, you will learn how to exploit your opponent's weaknesses, and you will learn how to take home that sweet, sweet victory. Now my mission to improve the Spellbreak player base has began, so let's get into episode 1 of Spellbreak Academy, and it's a big one. In-game awareness. So in-game awareness is a very broad term, so I'm going to be dividing it into 3 videos covering 4 sections: tools, terrain, zone knowledge, and tying it all together. In this video, we'll go ahead and cover the tools. Tools are everything the player has at their disposal to interact with the game and other players, and I've broken this down into 5 subcategories: class, talents, gauntlets, rune, and gear. For the player's class, this will be the first major decision you make when queuing for a game of Spellbreak. Your class allows you to essentially pick a playstyle or an influence of a playstyle before you ever set foot in the game, so it's important to know what your class can do and how it can affect you and your opponent's gameplay. You will want to look at the movement options your class provides, what sort of extra sources of damage you can get out of it, and also any utility the class provides that you can't really get anywhere else. For an example, we'll look at Pyromancer. For movement options, the class provides a very versatile skill in Firefly, which lets you dive into your flame wall and begin flying for a short period, and this can be reactivated as long as the flame wall is up as well. It's great for a movement mix-up tool, especially against Frostborns and Stone Shapers, and it can also help kite Toxicologists as well. For damage, the class offers Ignite with the Combust skill at level 1, Pyrolysis at level 3, and Conflagration at level 4, with Ignite being the most useful. For utility, Combust and Conflagration are great tools. Combust gives you a much larger splash radius on fireballs that hit a surface, as well as the Ignite effect, which allows you to track your opponents behind obstacles for 2 ticks, and Conflagration, which allows you to provide small additional pressure in a closed-in environment. And these are the types of things you need to think about before you ever enter a game. Likewise, your talent selection is important in this way as well. For your mind, body, and spirit slots, you need to be thinking about how this can best benefit your selected class and playstyle. Similarly to classes, things to look out for would be extra sources of movement, extra sources of damage, extra survivability, and extra utility. Talents that provide extra sources of movement would include Escapist or Runic Fluency. Extra damage would include talents like Fervor with the extra cast speed, Focus Mana, or Recklessness. Extra survivability would include talents like Fortitude, Recovery, or Harmony. And finally, extra utility would include talents like Harmony, Thirsty, or Spellslinger. This is very important, as some talents are optimally played when you alter your playstyle a bit. For example, getting extra damage from Focus Mana requires you to monitor your mana a bit more and maybe levitate a bit less before you fire your first spell. Harmony allows you to charge head-on into spells and effects you might want to avoid otherwise. And Thirsty encourages you to be near teammates when you heal and to disengage from combat often so you can constantly keep a passive healing effect up. This will help you round out your playstyle, and obviously some talents are generally better than others, but it's still good to know what they all do. The third subcategory are your gauntlets, your source of damage and class utility in the game. Your first gauntlet, and also the one you can't get rid of, is determined by whichever class you picked, so be sure to choose wisely. Your second or offhand gauntlet is intended to either strengthen your main gauntlet through spell interactions or extra utility for its intended playstyle, or it can be used to cover the weaknesses of your main gauntlet. The main things you need to be aware of with your gauntlets are spell damage, sorceries, effective range, elemental interactions, and miscellaneous effects. Spell damage is something that is worth memorizing, especially in the early game, as there is quite a difference between a common gauntlet and an epic gauntlet, and as your source of damage, it is also worth spending some time in the practice area to become proficient at aiming and learning the trajectory of each spell. If you know your damage output, especially if you have talents that increase your overall damage, then you will have a better idea of when to push, when to reset, and when to flee. This is where your mechanics really matter. If you can't land your spells, you're going to have a hard time, and there's nothing anyone can teach you other than what they do to train their aim that's going to help you. You're going to need to put in the time and practice. Once that's done, you can start really testing your limits, and if you're good enough, you can even turn a losing fight around or even take on a fight with a player double the health of your own. Moving on to sorceries, these are usually what the special class skills are based around. Conduit uses Sorceries for Power Surge and Overload. Pyromancer uses its Sorcery for Firefly and Pyrolysis. You get the picture. Depending on your class, Sorceries can either be used for damage, utility, or both depending on the circumstance. And this is the first time I'm going to be talking about cooldowns, and this is very important. Sorceries possess the same damage and effect no matter what rarity of gauntlet you or the opponent has, so the only limiting effect sorceries have are cooldowns. I cannot stress enough how important it is to learn the cooldowns for each sorcery. This is invaluable information that will clue you into your opponent's burst capabilities, their movement ability, and what other sort of utility they might be able to get away with. If your opponent is a toxicologist and drops down a toxic cloud for vanishing Misc, you need to know that he can't drop another cloud until 15 seconds has passed, so you're relatively safe for that period of time. Same goes for Stone Shapers and their 10-second cooldown on their Boulder Fall sorcery. It will help you know when you're safe and when you're not, and this information turns fights around all the time. Next is to touch on the identity of each gauntlet with effective range. Toxic and Frost are the easiest examples, as Toxic is obviously a shotgun and is meant for close range, but surprisingly can still provide some pressure at mid-range too, although it is arguably more difficult. Frost is a sniper, mid to long range for that one, and this is where you can really start filling in the blanks of whether you want to cover your main gauntlet's weaknesses or double down on your main gauntlet's strengths. What I mean by that is, let's say you're running Pyromancer, I just really like Pyromancer right now, and you have the choice between a Frost Gauntlet or a Toxic Gauntlet. With a Frost Gauntlet, you'll be able to hit opponents more easily at long range, aerial opponents are easier to hit, moving targets are easier due to the projectile speed, and you have your Fire Gauntlet served as a mid to close range option. Frost will even act as defense too with the Flash Freeze sorcery. Each gauntlet has a designated role despite the lack of spell interactions. With Toxic, you do have access to a useful spell interaction, Dragonfire, but you sacrifice any viability at long range. You're essentially doubling down on the close range viability of your current setup while completely ignoring its weakness. You can still make this work, you just have to play differently and more aggressively. And there we touched on elemental interactions. It's important to know which elemental interactions do what, so when you're faced with a choice for yourself or a build from your opponent, you know what to expect. Let's take Frost and Stone for example. You can freeze a boulder mid-air to let it fall and create a frosty area of slow and freezing to allow for free damage and follow-up. If you're a Frostborn, you can break apart your Frost Trails with Stone and freeze opponents that way. And the main takeaway from this section is if you're going to rely on elemental interactions to an extent, be mindful about what the goal for using it is. Are you going to be using your interactions to deal damage? Are you going to use it to CC? Are you going to use it as area denial? Just think about the goal you're trying to achieve, and that should help you. The last part about gauntlets I'm going to talk about is miscellaneous effects, which includes unique interactions that each gauntlet has, the most notable being Toxic's Corrosion. Corrosion, of course, lets you melt an opponent's armor for an additional 12 damage over 3 ticks, so 3 ticks of 4 armor damage over time, and this actually serves as a tracking tool as well, since each time you damage your opponent in any way, their health bar is visible even through walls and obstacles, which is pretty useful. Another example would be how a tornado from a wind sorcery pulls enemies in, so you can either combo with a spell interaction or land a frost snipe for free. All 5 of these concepts should be factored into your decisions to choose the correct offhand gauntlet and should be kept in mind for your opponent when you run into one. The fourth subcategory is your rune selection. This is going to be our main source of mobility, so be sure to choose wisely. I made a rune tier list not too long ago that ranks each rune in the current meta if you'd like to check it out. It's pretty relevant to every class you have to choose from, and I have 3 things to keep in mind for your rune selection. These are going to be your cooldown, the type of movement offered, and any extra utility the rune provides. Cooldown is going to be very important for your rune selection, as your rune is only good for you as long as you can use it. If you blow a 13-second teleport, you're basically without a rune for 13 seconds, and that's not what we want most of the time. Not to say anything bad about teleport, it's a great rune, but that cooldown is brutal. Alright, so I wouldn't worry too much about cooldown if you have a rare dash or a rare spring step or higher, as these 2 runes tend to be pretty short in the cooldown department, and if you're running runic fluency for an extra rune charge and shorter cooldowns, that's even better. Once the cooldowns for your runes reach the 6 to 7 second territory, that's where you really want to start paying attention. Runes like Flight, Teleport, and even Shadow Step are really important to keep track of for this reason. Let's take Shadow Step for example, since it's the newest released rune at this time. Let's say you're going up against a Toxicologist and he's trying to burst you for everything you know and love. It's important to know that Vanishing Misc has a 15-second cooldown and 3-second invisibility duration, and a legendary Shadow Step has a 7-second cooldown with a 2-second invisibility timer. I didn't even look up the wiki for that one, you just have to really get in the habit of memorizing these values. And by the way, for rune cooldowns, it's always best to assume the guy has a legendary rune. If you're wrong and he doesn't have one, you just have have extra time, and if you assume you have more time than you actually do, then you might get popped for 70 damage, so always assume the guy has a legendary rune. Anyway, what you want to do is bait and wait out the enemy's Shadow Step so you can go in without risking getting hit by all of his class's damage at once. Once he comes out of Shadow Step, you know you have at least 7 seconds to counterattack before he can enter Invisibility again for more outbreak damage. Of course, you have to account for if he runs Runic Fluency as well, so watch out for a second Shadow Step, but you get the idea. You always want to have a section in the back of your mind open for tracking your opponent's cooldowns. Another small example would be if your opponent blows 2 dashes right in front of you, you can pretty much assume that the guy can't really do anything meaningful in terms of movement for at least 3 seconds, as the base cooldowns for a legendary dash is 3.5 seconds, and you just saw him use 2 in a row, so he's either using Conduit or Runic Fluency, or potentially both, but usually Runic Fluency. It's all about recognizing windows of attack and weakness, and as long as you stay mindful mid-fight and not autopilot, you should turn out okay, or at least be able to see where your mistakes are. Type of movement is a kind of short section since it's pretty much just learned through practice and self-explanatory to an extent. Basically, it's just being aware of what each rune can do from a movement perspective. Shadow Step and Dash both dash in a direction, Spring Step does a long hopping animation, Flight can fly, Teleport can teleport a long distance away, all that stuff. This is mainly just to make sure you're aware that Dash and Spring Step are special cases that can transfer momentum into other movements such as Levitate, and to be aware of the height advantage you can gain as well as what you can do horizontally to dodge spells and put yourself in a better position. Just be aware of it and all the tech associated with it so you're prepared if your opponent uses it against you. Now for utility, it's another short section, but you still want to be aware of it. Typically, you want to use runes more for the movement they offer rather than what utility you can use, but I'll go over it just so it's on the record and you can be more aware of it. For this, I'm talking about things like Invisibility, Chronomaster, and Teleport. Invisibility for obvious reasons. It lets you reset a lot easier, it can allow you to engage an enemy easier, and it lets you escape. And most importantly, it allows you to proc Outbreak on Toxicologists for big damage. This utility is best used as part of Shadow Step, as Shadow Step also has a dash attached to it, so it can be used to also dodge incoming spells and other sources of damage, as well as close the distance for an easy close range hit. For Chronomaster, the utility just lets you automatically rewind to your health and armor 4 seconds before it expires, so it's pretty easy. Just keep in mind that if an enemy sees when and where you activate it, it's very exploitable. Same thing if you use it, just make sure that your opponent can't see you when you use it for the safest result. And I put Teleport here mainly because you can still rotate your character model while in the wind-up animation. You'll still be able to teleport to the same place, but again your character will turn, so you can do head fakes and throw off your opponent that way. I really just wanted an excuse to add the head fake in. Also be mindful if an opponent tries to use this on you. Also go to where they initially look, not where they turn to. Alright, the last subcategory of your tools is going to be your gear, and what I mean by this is your amulet, belt, and boots. This is not going to be a very long section at all, because basically all that matters is getting lucky with loot and what rarity you can find for each of the 3 pieces of gear. This is most important in the early game as everyone starts out with no gear, so if you can find gear while everyone else is still looking for some, you're in a good place. And as a general rule, I try not to start fights until I at least find a belt. Reason being is there are armor shards and health potions lying around in good loot areas. And if I can't restore any armor, then I can only use half the resources available to me. Not only that, but finding a belt on the drop immediately increases your effective health by quite a good margin, so you have more margin for error than your opponent if you can grab one before they do. Keep in mind that picking up a fresh belt means you have instant armor, so don't be afraid to do that in the middle of a fight if you find one. It's a good practice just to pick up anyway. For the early game in terms of gear, your priority for the most part is going to be belt, then boots, then amulet. If you're running a Frostborn or Conduit build though, then your priorities might be belt, then amulet, then boots. Either way, finding a good belt comes first, as extra health is better than anything else at that point. Once you have extra health, then you can get quick exiles on your opponents and then loot third gear. A good rule of thumb if you have mediocre gear is to start looking for early exiles. Other players are the most efficient source of loot in the game as they tend to carry very good gear for themselves and very good gauntlets as well as a decent amount of heals, so be sure to be looking for early exiles if you need to be. To conclude the tools section, you have to be mindful that these are the same tools that your opponent has as well, and the tools of Spellbreak are all about mastering your mechanics and aim through practice, knowing your cooldowns, and knowing where you are strong and where your opponent is as well. Spellbreak is a dance of optimal range, movement, and execution. There is a lot in Spellbreak that relies on your mechanical skill, but if you have a plethora of game sense and knowledge on your side, this can be overcome to an extent. So be sure to keep these tips in mind to help you outthink and outplay your opponent. Anyway, that's going to do it for part 1. Hope you all enjoyed. I originally wanted this to be a shorter video with all 4 concepts, but it ended up being too much information to really be condensed in a way I would like. So we're going to be covering the other 3 concepts in a separate video. If I have to split it up more than that, then I guess you'll get more, so stay tuned. We have a lot to cover. I'm going to try to get these out quicker than once a weekend, but we'll ultimately have to see. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Hopefully you learned something today. Please be sure to like and subscribe, follow the socials and Twitch in the box below, do the YouTube thing, and I will see you all out there. Y'all have a wonderful day, everyone.